continued right up until 1939.
La peine de mort était censée être moralisatrice et exemplaire. C'est-à-dire que si on avait assisté à une exécution, on ne serait plus jamais un criminel. Ce qui était totalement faux, car on a de nombreux cas de criminels qui ont été eux-mêmes décapités alors qu'ils avaient assisté déjà à plusieurs exécutions. Les exécutions publiques donnant lieu à des manifestations de foule absolument scandaleuses, la foule chantant, lançant des colibets aux condamnés, les gens arrivant ivres, ayant passé la nuit à faire la fête, donc on a décidé que c'était fini.
The last man to be publicly executed in France was multiple murderer Eugene Weidemann. Unknown to French authorities, a stills photographer and a film cameraman recorded the event. When photographs of the execution were published, the government was embarrassed. As a result, all French executions would now take place behind prison walls. However, the press was still permitted to publish details of what happened. In the United States, public executions also continued until the 1930s. The last public hanging took place in Missouri in 1937. As in other Western countries, executions in the United States were now hidden behind prison walls. They continued to be public in the sense that they were news. As witnesses, journalists became the eyes and ears of Americans.
Flash, United Press, Trenton, Hoffman executed, 8:47 1/2.
I've kind of come full circle in the last few years. I've suggested that maybe we ought to put it on public television at prime time. It's interesting that people will say, well, I don't want my children watching something like that. Well, maybe they're the ones that need to be targeted the most. I mean, if it's so popular, and if it's thought to do such great things in terms of the message it sends out, let's do it at 7 o'clock at night instead of midnight.
In China, executions are carried out in public. Amnesty International recorded nearly 2,000 executions in the past 12 months, but believe that the true figure is far higher. The condemned are paraded through the streets before being shot once in the back of the head. Saudi Arabia also executes in public, the method beheading by sword outside the mosque. In the last 3 years, over 200 people have been executed, 70% of them foreigners. Nigeria ranks third in executions after China and Iran. The condemned are put to death in public by firing squad. 100 Nigerians were executed last year. But public executions are not always popular. This triple hanging in Afghanistan led to mob violence. In the United States, even though executions take place behind prison walls, they can still be public events. Pro-death penalty groups gather to offer rowdy support for capital punishment, particularly if the condemned is black. In America, executions are seen by state witnesses. Their duty is to confirm that the sentence of the courts has been carried out to its conclusion. Many states allow the family of the murder victim to watch the execution, and some states allow the family of the condemned to witness the sentence being carried out. What happens when someone is put to death in the United States? Here, in North Carolina's Central Prison, career criminal David Lawson was executed in 1994. Lawson, suffering all his life from undiagnosed clinical depression, was sentenced to death for shooting a man while robbing his house. At trial, Lawson demanded the death penalty. But after receiving psychiatric treatment in prison, he appealed against the sentence. One witness to David Lawson's execution was his attorney, Marshal DAYAN.
The circumstances that come together to land a person on death row are often related to class, to where the person comes from. David, for example, was not a native North Carolinian. He came to North Carolina from Michigan in search of his birth father, so that when the jury was making a decision about whether David was to live or die, this was not one of their native sons. This was not someone whose family they knew. Rather, this was a stranger who had come into their community and taken the life of one of their native sons. In David's case, it was particularly difficult since David was suffering from clinical depression and told his lawyer that he preferred a death sentence to life imprisonment, and his trial lawyer obliged, and therefore there was no mitigating evidence put on in David's sentencing hearing at all, except David himself, who asked the jury for the death penalty.
He sat there 5 years, and no one seemed to care. So then all of a sudden someone cared. They find out about his chemical imbalance, put him on medication, get him to live with a good, healthy mind, and know how he's supposed to think and live. And all they were doing to me was fattening the calf for slaughter. And that is exactly what they did.
Early on the morning of June 15th, 1994, North Carolina prepared to put David Lawson to death in its gas chamber. The execution team was led by Warden Gary Dixon. It was his first execution.
The warden had assured me that that he had talked to prison officials in other states that had employed the gas chamber, and that David really would be unconscious in about 30 seconds and would be dead within 3 minutes. And I had assured him that I had read 40 to 50 affidavits of eyewitnesses to gas chamber executions, and my belief after reading those affidavits was that that was not so. He came in and he mouthed, "I'm okay." Within 2 or 3 minutes, prison personnel came in, put a mask over David's face. The mask covered his eyes. It left a hole for his nose, and then there was an area around his mouth that had small holes to let the gas in. And they strapped the mask to a post behind the chair so that his head was stationary. And they strapped him to the chair at legs and arms, and then they left. And we waited. And before the process began, David shouted out, "I'm human! I'm human!" And he did that about every 15 seconds. And then, suddenly we heard a loud bang, and then saw a big cloud of smoke rise up from the floor. And we knew that was the gas. And David took a breath and shook violently. He really gasped very loudly. And then he shouted again, "I'm human!" and he was holding his breath. And then he would gasp when he couldn't hold his breath anymore. And again, he would shake violently and gasp loudly, and then sort of release, and again try and call out, "I'm human!" And about 2 or 3 minutes into this process, he couldn't say human anymore. And he said, "Hume! Hume!" And then 2 or 3 minutes later, he couldn't say that, but he continued to grunt. Again, his calling out, and then later his grunting was broken by his gasping, taking in a breath, shaking, and then settling back, and then trying to call out again. And that went on from 2:01 a.m. to about 2:10.
I just said, God, please let it end soon. I did not want David to suffer any more than he had to.
It took 18 minutes for David Lawson to die.
This is the first execution I witnessed, and the 4 or 5 months following David's execution were very, very difficult for me. I had a very difficult time returning to work. I had a difficult time getting on with my life.
Shortly after the Lawson execution, Gary Dixon resigned as warden of Central Prison.
We don't know for sure, in a general manner, whether or not capital punishment actually deters others from committing further murders. We do know that it's a specific deterrent. We know that David Lawson will never commit another murder, either inside a prison or outside a prison. And that's important to me, just as a matter of public safety.
The concept of spectacle has always been important to the state when carrying out executions. In former times, the spectacle centered on ever more painful and gruesome methods of putting people to death.
The nature of punishment in general is very different then. We do not use imprisonment. Imprisonment is not the form of punishment. In fact, anything that is a felony, most forms of theft, burglary, all sorts of offences nowadays that would be regarded as relatively minor, all of those are felonies, and the penalty for felony is death, and death normally by hanging.
There is one method of execution which, above all others, is the product of a darkly ingenious desire, not only to inflict pain, but to create the most powerful spectacle. It was the English punishment for treason, known as hanging, drawing, and quartering.
It was as follows, that you were to be dragged to the place of execution upon a hurdle. When you had actually got to the place of execution, you were then half-hanged. Well before you are dead, you are cut down, and then the true horror begins. The first stage of execution is that your private parts are cut off and burned before your face. Then you were slashed from the crutch to the chest, opened and your bowels torn out and burned again. People are regularly fully conscious to this point. Then the body was severed into 4 parts and the head finally cut off. With Guy Fawkes, it's actually recorded at the beginning of the 17th century. He tries to, as it were, take a running jump, in other words, to break his neck once he is hanged. Unfortunately, he does not break his neck, he breaks the cord, and so he is absolutely fully conscious as the whole of that terrible operation is performed.
In 1837, the government changed in Britain. The old bloody code, which punished most criminal offences with death, was replaced by a less capricious and draconian system of justice.
There's a key moment in the history of execution in this country, and that's 1837, because by then the Whigs are in power in this country and the capital code is being slowly dismantled, and after that date only murderers are hanged. Still something like 400 or 500 of them between 1837 and 1868, but it does make execution an unusual, a less usual event, as it were, compared with times past. So if anything, executions become more loaded, more people go to attend them, especially when they're spectacular executions and spectacular murders, like the case of Courvoisier, for example.
Francois Courvoisier was a French servant living in London. He murdered his master, Lord William Russell. Courvoisier's death mask, made by Madame Tussaud, commemorates his execution. 40,000 people came to see him hanged. Among the crowd was the novelist William Thackeray. The event had a terrible impact on him, which he recorded in an essay, Going to See a Man Hanged. It was a turning point in public sensibility. Thackeray not only sympathized with Courvoisier's plight, he was disgusted that the state was killing someone for his supposed benefit.
As the clock began to strike, an immense sway and movement swept over the whole of that vast, dense crowd, and a great murmur arose, more awful, bizarre, and undescribable than any sound I'd ever heard before. Women and children began to shriek horridly. Just then, from under the black prison door, a pale, quiet head peered out. Courvoisier bore his punishment like a man. He went and placed himself at once under the beam. The tall, grave man in black twisted him round swiftly, and drawing from his pocket a nightcap, pulled it tight over the patient's head and face. The sight has left on my mind an extraordinary feeling of terror and shame. It seems to me that I have been abetting an act of frightful wickedness and violence performed by a set of men against one of their fellows.
From about the 17th century onwards, and particularly in the 18th century, the elites of some of the major cities in Europe began to express a degree of anxiety and as it were, embarrassment about the open execution, the public execution, and especially the maiming and the injuring. The business of carrying out the death penalty becomes less a matter of inflicting injury on a body and displaying the state's power and the awesome power to punish, and more a matter of somehow or other ending life.
With the coming of the Industrial Revolution, states began to look for what they considered more humane ways of executing people. The first example was the guillotine, a product also of the French Revolution.
Pendant la Révolution, alors là, ça devient une véritable usine, puisqu'on va avoir des périodes où il y aura un grand nombre de décapitations. Et j'ajoute que sans la guillotine, ça aurait été impossible. Parce que ça aurait été impossible d'exécuter manuellement le nombre de condamnés qui sont décapités 30, 40, 50 dans la même journée. Parfois, à la suite, on a des choses terribles. Et le bourreau et ses aides deviennent d'une telle habileté, si je puis dire, que la décapitation d'un homme prend 1 minute. les corps se succèdent sur la machine, sur la planche, avec une rapidité absolument démoniaque, folle.
With the guillotine, executions became mechanized. The next development came 100 years later, with an improvement to hanging known as the drop. Before 1888, hanging meant slow strangulation. The drop, when successful, broke the neck, causing instant death. America searched for a new execution method to go with its image of itself as modern and civilized. With the coming of electric lights to New York City, a new execution technology was spawned, the electric chair. It was inspired by reports of a man dying, apparently instantaneously, after falling onto high-voltage electricity cables. In 1886, New York's Governor David Hill set up a commission to find, in his words, a humane replacement for hanging. The electric chair was invented by a dentist, and the first ones were ready within a year. The first man to die in the electric chair was William Kemmler, sentenced to death for killing his girlfriend with an axe. But Kemmler did not die cleanly. When the electricity hit him, he struggled in the chair, foam shooting from his mouth. Doctors and prison officials watched in horror as Kemmler cooked in the chair. He finally died after a second charge of electricity. There would be many more botched electrocutions, but despite its problems, the electric chair was adopted by many states and remains a powerful symbol of capital punishment in America. America's search for the perfect execution method continued with the invention in 1926 of the gas chamber. While slower and more painful than the electric chair, it caused less obvious trauma to the body. World War II would be a turning point in the history of capital punishment in the West. When the atrocities of the Nazi gas chambers were revealed, execution of war criminals followed.
The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany, once the holy city of Nazism, becomes the setting of an epic event. Here, under the vigilant eyes of Allied military police, the 20 most important surviving members of the Hitler gang go on trial.
Even though they were military executions, they satisfied a public demand for retribution. Many were filmed for newsreels and shown in cinemas throughout the world.
In Aversa, Italy, through the mists of early morning, General Anton Dostler of the German army walks to his death, convicted of multiple murder by an Allied court. Dostler, who ordered the death of 15 captured Americans in uniform, must pay for his crime like any murderer. The firing squad receives its rifles. Dostler is the first high German officer tried and convicted by the Allies. The sentence of the court is fulfilled.
War-torn Europe had had enough of killing and wanted to build a new and more humane order. In 1947, the Italian government abolished capital punishment. West Germany followed in 1949. One by one, the countries of Europe scrapped the death penalty. Great Britain had its last hanging in 1964, and capital punishment was abolished for all crimes, save piracy and treason in 1965.
The principal reason for its abolition was the fearful danger of a mistake being made and an innocent man being executed. And I think another reason was that there was very little convincing evidence that capital punishment was itself a deterrent to crime. And if it is not a deterrent to crime, it is really very difficult to think of any reason for justifying its retention.
France continued to use the guillotine until 1977. The death penalty was finally abolished in 1981. In America during the 1960s, the rise of the counterculture called many aspects of society and government into question. As America's involvement in Vietnam deepened, the anti-war movement challenged the state's authority. The civil rights movement brought sweeping social reforms. It was during this period of change that America's highest court declared existing death penalty laws unconstitutional.
The most important dateline tonight is the Supreme Court. A sharply divided court today ruled 5-4 that the death penalty is illegal in the form in which it is generally used today. While the court did not rule out completely the future use of the death penalty, it did say that as the penalty was applied in 3 test cases, it constituted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the 8th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution.
Legal scholars will be debating all summer whether the court did or did not flatly and irrevocably end capital punishment. The answer, for all practical purposes, seems to be it did. The confusion occurs because only 2 of the 5-man majority said the state can never take a life. The key votes were those of White and Stewart, who said the death penalty is applied so rarely these days, freakishly, sort of the way lightning strikes, that it is cruel and unusual punishment and no longer has any deterrent value. The difficulty is that they also indicated they might vote the other way if anyone could ever show them a case where the death penalty is automatically imposed.
When I started out my career, I think I was pretty much anti-death penalty, and at that point in time that made me fit into the view of a majority of Americans. In the late 60s, lots of people had misgivings about capital punishment in this country. But a couple of decades of working in prisons sometimes has a way of affecting your philosophy. I did not become pro-death penalty because I was a great fan of it. I think I viewed it more as a necessary evil than anything else.
Only 4 years later, the death penalty returned in America, where a bizarre drama was played out in the western state of Utah. The main actor was Gary Gilmore, a lifelong criminal who murdered 2 young men in cold blood for apparently no reason, except perhaps for one that would stun the American public. Gilmore had been sentenced to death. Unlike most of the condemned who appealed their sentences, Gilmore went before the State Board of Pardons to demand that he be executed. He wanted to be put to death.
Back up.
Other death row inmates who didn't want to be executed waited for the outcome with bated breath.
I would like to say one thing. I simply accepted a sentence that was given to me. I've accepted sentences all my life. I didn't know I had a choice in the matter. When I did accept it, everybody jumped up and wanted to start to argue with me. It seems that the people, especially the people of Utah, they want the death penalty, but they don't want executions. And when it became a reality, they might have to carry one out. Well, I started backing off on it. Well, I took them literal and serious when they sentenced me to death, just as if they just sentenced me to 10 years or 30 days in the county jail or something. I understood by the Utah law that I don't have to appeal. So I chose not to. I wanted the sentence carried out. I spoke personally before your Supreme Court. They said it was okay.
It seemed like a moment in which the world had been turned upside down. It seemed like a moment of real madness. I remember that my greatest hope at the time was that there was a legal process that would still have to be observed here, that this could not move forward that quickly, and that the law itself might be the greatest tool of rationality in handling this situation. I shortly learned that I was wrong about that.
On January the 17th, 1977, as the world's media gathered outside the state prison in Provo, Utah, the extraordinary drama of Gary Gilmore and his manipulation of the state reached its climax. Gary Gilmore's last words as he faced the 5-man firing squad were, "Let's do it."
Many of us in corrections really didn't even take the reinstatement of the death penalty seriously as a real threat until after the Gilmore execution. The Gilmore execution was almost unreal for a lot of us because he went out and manipulated the state of Utah into almost a state-sanctioned suicide. I mean, he dropped his appeals and he said, "Go on and kill me."
Gary's willingness, his insistence on the execution going forth, and particularly on the kind of speedy schedule that he produced with it, I think that resulted in giving the death penalty a momentum that would have been hard to come by for several years in the country. I think that once that ice was broken, the death penalty was back, and I think it made it much easier for Florida to put Spenkelink to death.
The next man executed was John Spenkelink. Spenkelink didn't want to die, but Gilmore had set the ball rolling, and more executions were inevitable.
We started to take it a little more seriously when Florida executed John Spenkelink. Now all of a sudden, here's a guy that's been on death row a long time. Doesn't want to die, but he's lost his appeals and he's fought it to the end, and now the state kills him.
When Don Cabana became warden of Mississippi's state penitentiary, he knew that he might be called upon to carry out an execution. In the event, he was required to do it 3 times. When he took the job, he believed that his combat experience in Vietnam would prepare him for what lay ahead.
I thought the wartime combat exposure in Vietnam would really be a solid preparation for this notion of execution. One of the first utterances, frankly, out of my mouth on the first execution I did was I turned to one of the 2 physicians who was standing right next to me and said, "Good God, there's nothing that can prepare you for this. Absolutely nothing." It's a very violent process. In its own right, it's not much different from the electric chair. It's full of gore, and to say that it impacts the staff who are having to stand there and participate as well as watch, or to say that it impacts the witnesses who are observing is a mild conclusion. Watching an inmate that you're escorting into a gas chamber, strapping him into a chair, and listening and observing an inmate say to his keepers and his executioners, thank you for your treatment. I appreciate the way you've treated me. Or worse yet, the almost heartbreaking question when they look up at one of the guards strapping them in the chair and ask something like, "What should I do?" Like there's some magical secret to how to survive the process, get through it until you're rendered unconscious. I think what they're asking is, what do I do and how do I do this to get through it the best I can?
Lethal injection was invented to make executions more palatable to the state employees who had to carry them out, and the public who had to read about them. Lethal injection uses 3 chemicals in a sequence, which render the inmate unconscious before paralyzing heart and lungs. It is the ultimate modern execution method. Sanitized, medicalized, no trauma to the body. The first man to die by lethal injection was Charles Brooks in Texas. Because the manual process was often botched, it can take up to 20 minutes, a machine was invented to reduce human error. The inventor is Fred Lucha, a self-styled engineer and author of a report which claims there were no gas chambers in Nazi concentration camps. Lucha's machine, meant to be foolproof, has led to botched executions on 3 occasions, twice in Illinois and once in Missouri.
I find the lethal injection process quite objectionable. I don't care for it because I think it sanitizes the whole process and makes it so much easier for us to live with. I think electrocution and the gas chamber and hanging and all of their gory reality is what the public should know about and should understand. But we've gotten to a point where executions are made easier and easier simply because it's such a much cleaner process than it used to be.
One of the things that we see in 19th and 20th century execution technology is a development of a kind of a cosmetic sanitizing gloss on the procedure, so that the staff involved think of themselves as being professionals just doing a job, that the technology is developed in a way which distances the human beings concerned from their actions. So that, for example, someone simply presses a lever in the case of the guillotine. Today with the lethal injection, two members of the execution team simply press a button. No one quite knows who it is that's been responsible for the killing, since it's always a team effort. One feels that the whole apparatus is designed to kind of disavow what's really going on, in a sense. It's to, on the one hand, execute people, at the same time to pretend that there's no suffering being inflicted, that the state is behaving in a way that's civilized rather than barbaric.
The problem of violent crime and how to deal with it is not just an American one. For 15 years, the tiny and picturesque island of Trinidad had enjoyed a moratorium on the death penalty. Though Trinidad gained independence from Great Britain in 1962, her final court of appeal is the Privy Council in London. Since 1993, Trinidad has followed a Privy Council recommendation that the condemned should have their sentences commuted to life after spending 5 years on death row. In July 1994, death row inmate Glen Ashby was about to have his sentence commuted. Then, public outrage over an unrelated set of murders led to a demand that someone be hanged in Trinidad.
Around that time, 2 young women were killed quite brutally. Those young women were middle-class housewives who were perceived by the general population as being well-to-do. They were perceived as representing the class of persons who were under siege by criminals. and they were brutally killed and raped. And it caused a huge outcry and a demand for the government to do something. And it is in those circumstances that Glen Ashby's warrant for execution was read.
Glen Ashby's last-minute appeal was in front of the Trinidad courts. His lawyers also appealed to the highest court, the Privy Council in London.
The Privy Council accepted an undertaking by counsel on behalf of the Attorney General that he would not be executed until the Court of Appeal had heard the case and the Privy Council had heard the case.
There was no undertaking given by the state that the execution would not be carried out. And you would recall that I referred to the mandatory nature of the warrant. The marshal at that point, when faced with a situation where the time for execution had come and there was no judicial order preventing him or no undertaking on the part of the state, he proceeded as he was required to do by the presidential warrant.
While the Privy Council was considering the case, Ashby was hanged in secret at 6 a.m. There were no press witnesses, but one of Ashby's neighbors on death row heard his friend being taken away and hanged.
He heard the sound of a cell door being opened. He heard Ashby shouting and screaming and so on. And what sounded to him like a struggle took place. Ashby apparently called out to the other prisoners on death row, indicating that he was going to be executed. He also called out to one of his friends on death row, another prisoner called Clark. I think he asked him for some kind of help. And Guerra says the whole thing could not have taken more than 2 minutes. The estimate he gave me was between 1 and 2 minutes. He said after that, the next thing he heard was the clang of the trapdoor. And that was it.
Unknown to the Privy Council and those appearing before them, Ashby had in fact been executed during the course of the hearing before the Court of Appeal. Now, it's not for me to comment at all on why that should have happened, but that was the sequence, and it was very disturbing.
Glen Ashby's body was taken from the gallows and buried at another prison 30 miles away. Desmond Ashby learned of his son's hanging from a friend, but he couldn't believe the news until he had heard it on the radio.
I changed and I went down to the state prison. When I reached there, I went to the gate as usual and I pressed the bell. The officers opened the little hatch there and I told them that I'm Glen Ashby's father and I come to see him. He told me that I cannot see Glen Ashby at this present time. He go across the road and when he is ready, he will let me know. I did went across the road and after 10 to 15 minutes, I seen I have not been called. So I went back and I pressed the bell and he told me I still have to wait. The state wanted to prove to the population they are doing something where crime is concerned. My son was there at that time, so he was the example for the state that they are doing something about the killing in Trinidad and Tobago.
The state felt that it was very important that Glen Ashby be killed at that point in time and no other, because the state may have perceived that society's demand for an execution was more important than any other consideration.
People confuse the death penalty issue with the whole crime situation in the country because Trinidad has had a spate of crimes recently. I mean, not only murders, we've had a lot of robberies, car stealing, burglaries, larcenies, various other crimes. So people are feeling, what's the word, embattled.
Public sentiment is part of the consensus which creates law in the first place. And if the public consensus is that the sentences lawfully constituted on the law books of this country ought to be applied, then they have to be applied. That is the social contract which exists between the citizen and the state.
The death penalty is revenge, pure and simple. Somebody does something particularly evil to us, and we do unto the evildoer, and it's a process that allows us to say, now, see what we've done to you? Don't mess with us. Doesn't make us any safer. I found myself walking away at 2:30 in the morning after an execution, sarcastically musing to myself, isn't the state of Mississippi so much safer this morning now that we've killed another one? But I don't presuppose that anymore to even be the purpose of the death penalty, to make people safer, although that's what's espoused very often. It's revenge, and we do that because basically it makes us feel better.
70 to 80% of the public are strongly in favor of capital punishment and feel that it's appropriate. And I think one of the primary reasons that I support capital punishment is that it's a proper expression of society's outraged at criminal conduct, in particular the most heinous type conduct, taking another human's life.
In America, society's outrage over rising crime is such that few politicians can hope to win an election without declaring support for the death penalty. But does the death penalty offer any solace to victims' families? College student Krista Lee Hoyt was the victim of a gruesome sex killing. Her mother, Anne, speaks for many victims' families who demand the death penalty.
Krista was little. She was a little over 5 foot tall, maybe weighing about 100 pounds. And of course, Danny Rolling's a lot bigger. So it didn't take him much time to succumb her. So then he took her to the bedroom where he disrobed her. And he raped her. And then he stabbed her in the back. And then after he stabbed her in the back, he gutted her and cut off her nipples and laid them on her insides. And then he left. And then he realized he lost his wallet. He came back to her apartment looking for his wallet. And then he decided to decapitate her. And he put her head on a shelf. Danny Rolling, I think Manny's brother said it the best. He said he was a life form gone bad and needed to be done away with. When he's executed, it'll give us a little peace to know that he's gone and will not hurt anyone else.
You hear the argument a lot that because we're executing someone, we're somehow devaluing human life. I like to take that and reverse it around. I think that by carrying out an execution, we are saying to that prisoner or any possible defendant out there or murderer out there that we value life so much that we're willing to exact the highest price from you for taking that life.
7-year-old Susan Jaeger was kidnapped and brutally murdered, but her mother, Marietta, campaigns against the death penalty.
They went into his home with search warrants and therein found irrefutable evidence in his freezer. And then brought that back and confronted him with that in the presence of his attorney. And at that time in the state of Montana, one of the penalties for kidnap murder was the death penalty. But by that time, I had come to understand that God's idea of justice is not punishment, but restoration. And I didn't know if this man could be restored. He was a very sick young man. But I felt that I had to offer him that opportunity. And so I asked the FBI that he not be executed. And I didn't feel that in any way that would honor Susie to have someone killed in her name, that would violate and profane her all the more. Her life was a gift of goodness and sweetness and beauty to me. And to kill someone in her name would have been horrible.
The real larger issue for me, long term, frankly, remains when the time arrives for me to be judged by my God, is how I answer for my role in the execution process.
Don Cabana found the answer to his question in November 1994, when he suffered a near-fatal heart attack.
As I laid in the hospital, asking, almost pleading with my priest to offer me some explanation that made sense and offer me some advice. Give me some answer to the question. And there wasn't any. He just said, I don't know. I don't know. I don't think you have to worry about God holding you responsible, but then I don't know. God considers all life sacred. If I live to be 80, I will recall every wrinkle, every crease in the face, the style of the haircut, every reaction in the chamber. I will recall everything in minute detail about those men. I will recall in the minutest detail the heartbroken mothers, inmate mothers, victims, mothers. And I think finally I'm at a point where I can be actually thankful for those recollections, because now I think, and I'm not sure why I can say this, but after my personal experience with a heart attack and a life-threatening prospect, I'm convinced that I handled it as best anybody can handle it, and that ultimately what came out of it was a newfound conviction that there has to be a better way to handle our worst problems other than this.
A short history of the death penalty, together with details of current issues and further information, is available in a Channel 4 booklet. For a copy, please send a cheque or postal order for £2, made payable to Channel 4, to Lethal Justice, P.O. Box 4000, London W5 2GH.